So thanks to our dear friends in RCC Strategic Marketing, and on behalf of Rockland Community College's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, our School of Arts and Humanities, and our School of Education and Social Sciences, we extend a warm welcome and thanks to everyone for joining us for this event, which is a part of our Unity in Community initiative. This event features a conversation between Professor Konstantinos Ritsatos, we know him as Dino, instructor of history and program director for history and foreign language, and Mr. Mark Torres, the author of the book, Long Island Migrant Labor Camps, Dust for Blood. Mark's book chronicles a never before told story about the migrant labor camps in Suffolk County from their inception during World War II through their heyday in 1960 and culminating with their steady decline towards the end of the 20th century. In this conversation, Mark will discuss the sufferings of the camp's inhabitants and the factors that led to their eventual decline. We will also hear of the heroic efforts of certain individuals who work to improve the conditions for migrant workers on the eastern end of Long Island during this period. During this event, we ask that you please remain muted until asked to speak. Additionally, we'll be sharing a slide presentation during this session. You may choose the side-by-side mode from view options in Zoom so that you can see the speaker and the presentation at the same time. Please feel free to ask questions using the chat function at any time, but there will also be an opportunity to ask questions later in the program. We are recording today's program and we'll post it on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion website. And now here is Professor Dino Ritsatos, who will be our moderator. Dino?
Hi, everybody, and thank you. So just a brief background on our author and presenter today, Mark Torres. Mark Torres is the General Counsel for the Teamsters Local 810. He tirelessly represents thousands of unionized workers and their families in the greater New York area. He has a law degree from Fordham University School of Law and a bachelor's degree in history from NYU. He achieved his academic milestones while working full-time as a refrigeration engineer at NYU and attended classes in the evenings, all while raising a family. His commitment to the labor movement spans greater than 30 years. And with that being said, I'd like to introduce Mark Torres.
Thank you, Dino, and thank you everyone for being here today to hear about the presentation regarding my new book, Long Island Migrant Labor Camps, Dust for Blood. The book was released on March 22nd, 2021. The purpose of the book and this presentation is to identify the labor camps that existed in Suffolk County during the 20th century, to discuss the impact on the inhabitants of these camps and the surrounding communities, to introduce outspoken critics of the migratory labor system, and to explain the factors that led to the ultimate decline of the camps. It's important to point out that this history has never been shared before in any comprehensive format. So in many regards, it was like chasing ghosts. Most with intimate knowledge of the era had passed on, and there were very few secondary resources to rely upon. However, I was fortunate to have been able to review over 300 newspaper articles, scholarly articles and government data, over 1,000 pages of documents from the Suffolk County Department of Health, who was the governing agency of the camps at the time. I also conducted numerous interviews with people from varying sides of this era. I studied several red documentaries and benefited from the friendly and helpful staff at libraries, historical societies, and various universities. One thing I can say for certain, that the greater I delved into this history, the greater my obligation grew to tell the story. This story cannot be told without a true understanding of the importance of agriculture on Long Island at the time. 19th century immigrants from Eastern Europe brought with them the skills of growing potatoes. By 1850, over the 5,000 farms in Suffolk County, nearly all of them grew potatoes. In 1943, there were 55,000 acres of potatoes and 13,000 acres of other crops, such as cauliflower, string beans, and fruit, grown in the county. And by 1949, the county produced between 14 million and 18 million bushels of potatoes. And at this point, a fully developed industry was in place, led by the Suffolk County Farm Bureau, which was formed for the collective interests of the growers. Here you see a photograph of the 1940s of a car retrofitted in the shape of a potato with the slogan, "Eat Long Island potatoes." And it was an indication of the marketing campaign that was already underway early on. World War II created a nationwide shortage of farm labor. President Roosevelt signed the Emergency Farm Labor Program, and this created three distinct migrant streams of labor. The West Coast, the Imperial Valley of California, produced 80% of the nation's vegetables. The Midwest, from Texas through Canada, produced the majority of the nation's wheat. And the East Coast, from Florida to Maine, produced a variety of crops. This book focuses exclusively on the East Coast migrant stream. In Suffolk County, in 1943, there was a shortage of 2,700 farm laborers. Several attempts were made to fill this void. German POWs from Camp Upton were used, as well as Chinese American immigrants from New York City, Boy Scouts, high school students, and Polish immigrants from the Displaced Persons Act of 1848 were all used. But that was nothing more, that was just a Band-Aid attempt at trying to solve the constant labor shortage. Eventually, the US government contracted with the islands of Jamaica and Barbados to bring in farm laborers. However, by the late 1940s, in the wartime, when the war ended and the wartime program winding down, Suffolk County growers began to rely exclusively on, or mainly upon, Black farm workers from southern US states. Also, some contract workers from Puerto Rico were used, and they, because they were on the contract, enjoyed much better benefits and conditions of employment. In 1960, 4,500 migrant workers were in Long Island. 3,500 of them were Black from the southern states, and 1,500 or so from Puerto Rico. Here you see an indication of the vast fields. Today, anyone who visits these areas will now notice the large, well-decorated vineyards and large swaths of land, beautiful open land. Before all of that, they were largely potato fields and other large farms. The work is very intensive. You see the workers bending, crawling, kneeling. There's a term for that called stoop labor, and that's much more taxing on the body than perhaps appears to the regular person looking on. It's important to understand the relevant laws. In 1935, the government passed the federal law, the National Labor Relations Act. This federal law allows workers to join labor unions and engage in protected, concerted activities to address or improve working conditions. Sadly, agricultural workers were and still are specifically excluded from this federal labor law, and this left them extremely vulnerable throughout. One attorney described it as they took the most vulnerable part of the American labor force and threw them out of the lifeboat. Also, because many of the workers were from out of state or out of state citizens, they had little or no voting rights to better their conditions of employment. With thousands of laborers entering New York State each season for the harvest, they needed a place to be accommodated. New York State assigned several upstate counties and Suffolk County to begin using mobile labor camps. In 1946, the migrant registration law was enacted, and that required all employers, crew leaders, and contractors to register with the Department of Labor. In 1954 and 1958, Governors Dewey and Harriman signed sweeping laws to regulate the labor camps. Everything from lighting, air, heating, water, everything was governed by these regulations. And also, initially, local zoning was required for approval, which was not always given freely. In fact, early on, there was great opposition to labor camps, largely due to racial animus. However, that eventually waned because the county was so reliant upon labor for this agricultural output that eventually that opposition waned and the camps were constructed. In 1943, the 4 government-sponsored camps were put up in the towns of Conklin, Greenport, Kings Park, and Port Jefferson. In 1958, there were 28 registered labor camps in the county. 7 years later, a massive increase to 134 labor camps in the county. This by far was the peak period of this era covered in the book. There's a slight dip in 1960 to 120 camps, and then each successive decade, you see the slow and steady decline for reasons I will explain a bit later in the program. So what is a labor camp? The term is used interchangeably. It's simply a physical structure used to house migrant laborers. The larger camps consisted of barracks, small style cabin units, but there were many other types of structures of varying size and sophistication. In most cases, there were shacks, rundown buildings, private homes, old barns, trailers, abandoned structures, and in one case in Greenport, the site of a former historic mansion was used as a labor camp. The camps the camps that I was able to uncover through my research were always in poor to terrible conditions. They always took on a prison-like atmosphere, although workers were generally free to come and go, but the camps were always isolated, and that really placed a great hindrance on the workers to move as freely as they would have preferred. They were always unsanitary, poorly maintained, and hazardous, and of course dangerous with no security. And many workers slept in what was called a bullpen-style sleeping area, generally a large room with many bunk beds stacked up next to each other, and that was the extent of it. So that lent for no privacy. And because the workers were seen as outsiders, there was little public sympathy to help fight for bettering the conditions at the camps. The first recorded migrant labor camp in Suffolk County was known as the Lake Lodge Labor Camp. This was in Peconic, New York, a small hamlet on the North Fork. It's a 3-story lake cottage, and the camp was part of that building as well as the surrounding property. It opened in 1943, and approximately 100 farm workers from Jamaica, again under contract with the U.S. government, were brought in. They took the plane ride to New Orleans and took a long train ride up to Suffolk County, and the U.S. government paid for the cost of that. At the time was $100 per man. Within weeks, 3 other labor camps opened up in Greenport, Kings Park, and Port Jefferson, and all 4 total had approximately 400 farm workers from Jamaica. They were lauded for their tireless work ethic and production. They had extensive experience of working on plantations in Jamaica. The conditions at this camp were fair. However, that was largely because there was a lot of U.S. government oversight. And these camps generally operated until around 1947, when the U.S. ended the contracts with the island of Jamaica. Here you see a photograph of the Lake Lodge building. This was the first recorded labor camp, or the site of the first recorded labor camp. This building was used as well as makeshift buildings outside and to the rear of the property where workers were housed. By far, the largest and most notorious labor camp on Long Island, and perhaps New York State, was known as the Cutchong Labor Camp, located on Cox Lane in Cutchong. It was first established by 1944 by a group of farmers from South Hold and Shelter Island who formed a company called the Eastern Suffolk Cooperative. They formed this company to run the business of the camps, and they purchased the land as well. Army barracks, again with bullpen-style sleeping quarters, were constructed, as well as cabin-style units with military platform tents. This camp was one of the largest known labor camps that had the capacity to hold up to 300 workers at a season. It also was known as for having the only school for migrant children in New York. Helen Prince, a notable historian and educator from South Pole, was a teacher for more than a decade. And it also had a daycare center for children of migrant workers. Later, a small restaurant called the Dixie Bell Inn was at the site, as well as a small store which sold goods to workers at extremely high markups. Again, I'll get into that shortly. Here you see a photograph of the Cutchong labor camp. The small girl you see standing in the middle of the picture is in the middle of the road, which was known as Main Street. All the way in the back to the rear, you see a large bunker, which is where the single men slept, again in the bullpen style quarters. And to the right and left, you see the cabins with military tents draped over them. This was a fully functional and operational camp, but for purposes of operation, local farmers would just drive up to the camp, contract with the crew leaders and how many workers, and simply, if they had a pickup truck, the workers would jump in the back, they would drive them to the farm, they would work for the day and then bring them back here to this camp. Here you see an advertisement from the Eastern Suffolk Cooperative promoting the camp. At one time, this camp was touted in a local paper as a model labor camp. You'll soon find out that could not be further from the truth. Over the years, conditions continued to deteriorate. Here you see a photograph of Helen Prince in the classroom, or the room that was to be a classroom for the migrant children. This room was a small carved out room in the camp. It was right outside of this room was a leaking pipe with raw sewage and a terribly foul odor. Clearly not optimal conditions for educations. And when Ms. Prince, who was a staunch educator, lobbied for more funds to improve upon the class, she was told, "But Helen, you don't have to teach them anything, you just have to keep order." And it was that kind of indifference that you'll see that's prevalent throughout the majority of the camps in this era. Here you see a photograph of inside one of the cabins. You see the debris strewn, the dirty bedding, the walls bare, no fireproofing. naturally hazardous. Here's another image inside the camp. You notice the two bunk beds, one on the far right and the far left, that this would have had the capacity to sleep at least 4 individuals. And again, you notice the just general sloppiness and also hazardous conditions of the camp. And throughout the years, this camp continued to deteriorate. The conditions worsened. It was referenced in 1960's Harvest of Shame, a documentary by CBS Edward R. Murrow. It was aired on Thanksgiving Day in 1960 and intended to shame the nation for the poor treatment of farm workers throughout the country. At one point in the film, this camp was covered. Later in 1968, another documentary entitled What Harvest for the Reaper gave a much clearer picture of the conditions at the camp, as well as the economic exploitation that was going on. Again, there were numerous hazards. The bathroom facilities were always poor condition and limited. In one instance, there was one running bathroom for 38 men in the season. The bullpen style quarters always led for no privacy. Crime and violence were all too common. Sadly, in 1961, a fire occurred at this camp, killing 4 workers. Leroy McCoy and Charles Jordan were both found dead in their sleeping quarters. The man named James Davis was found dead after he reportedly re-entered the smoky building to retrieve a new pair of shoes he had bought. Sadly, he was overcome by the smoke and he too perished, as well as a man named James Overstreet. He was pulled out alive, but he succumbed to his injuries at a nearby hospital later that day. The cause of this fire was that the 4 workers snuck in the kerosene stove because they could not afford the 75-cent cost for meals. Truly tragic scenario with workers trying to cut corners out of impoverished and destitute, and that led to the loss of their lives. And quite frankly, it's a miracle many more people did not die that day. Over the years, the conditions continued to worsen. In 1970, the camp temporarily lost its permit. In 1983, the land was sold, and 1 year later, the Eastern Suffolk Cooperative dissolved 40 years after it first opened. However, before that, they also ran another labor camp approximately 4 or 5 miles from the Cutchong camp, known as the Greenport Labor Camp. This was the site of the former Richard Conklin mansion built in 1862 in Greenport. That was also the previous site of the Kerwin Golf Course and the Soundview Stock Farm. That was a farm that raised thoroughbred horses, including a champion horse known as Rarus, a champion for its day. Edward H. King, a prominent grower from the town of Orient, purchased the land and leased it to the Eastern Suffolk Cooperative to run the camp. One notable instance at this camp in 1947, there was approximately 200 workers from Mexico. They walked off the job protesting the wages they were earning. At the time, it was 60 cents. They felt they deserved more. There was a one-day hearing at a local school. The workers had no representation. The agricultural board heard the case and ruled immediately in favor of the growers, and the workers went back the next day. It is a notable, very rare instance of unity amongst a group of workers seen in this era, and perhaps most eras. This camp, the Greenport Labor Camp, was in operation until approximately 1966, when it closed. Here you see 2 photographs. On the left, you see through the trees the facade of the former mansion, again, which was used as the camp. And on the right, you see the structures that were created for the camp to the rear and the side of the property. And here you see a sketch of the Richard Conklin mansion, constructed in 1862, when it was constructed at the time. 1960 offered a lot more clearer records and data through my research. In Norfolk, the South Hole town had 24 camps with over 600 workers. In Southampton, which everyone knows the South Fork as the Hamptons and the rich and famous, but there were labor camps there too, and a lot of farms. In fact, they had 13 labor camps with over 200 workers. Riverhead, which is located a little bit more west, but right before the fork split, had the 30 camps with 400 workers. Brookhaven Township, which is far west towards Nassau County, getting closer to the city, is approximately 20 camps with 314 migrant workers. And Shelter Island, which is between the 2 forks, had 2 camps in 1960, but also 1 camp that I'll explain shortly, known as the Beanery plant. And one thing I'll point out for those not familiar with the geography, the furthest point on the South Fork from New York City is approximately 90 miles. So this is, in geography terms, very close to the heart of New York City. And the fact that this was never written about even made it more of a challenge and an obligation on my part to share this history. Here you see a map from created by the Suffolk County Migrant Labor and Slum Housing Commissions. Each dot you see on the map denotes a labor camp in 1960. There are 120 dots, 120 camps. scattered all about. To the left, top left is where Riverhead. To the top right, you'll see the North Fork, the large clusters of camps. And the bottom right, you see which is again the Hamptons, the South Fork. You'll see a lot of several dots there as well. One thing I'll point out with the labor camps particularly in the North Fork, there were and still are several generational farmers and growers still there. I had the wonderful opportunity to interview a man named Tom Wickham. The Wickham family has been farming in Cutchong for well over 300 years. And Mr. Wickham explained that his family always had the mantra of quality over quantity. So they did not use as many workers, and they also built facilities for the workers to stay on their own farm. So, and it was by note, naturally much better treatment than seen at the typical large camps that you'll learn more about. But here you can see a clear difference in the treatment of the workers with some of these generational growers. Unfortunately, that is a minority. The overwhelming majority of these camps were, in the conditions, as I will explain, as poor as they were. Here you see a photograph of a labor camp in Riverhead. You notice the structure in the middle, which looks like an outhouse. And these pictures are approximately 1970, as well as this one here, both again in Riverhead. You just notice the general sloppiness and also secretive nature of them. And I'll get into that whole element, particularly with the no trespassing laws, which the growers relied upon to keep outsiders away from these camps. Here's a photograph of the Beanery. The Beanery was a plant on Shelter Island in the 1950s. This plant was quite state-of-the-art. They flash froze lima beans and cauliflower in massive amounts and sold them to companies like Libby's and Birdseye. They were in operation for probably 7 years or so. They had a large diesel engine known as Big Bertha. You see a lot of moving mechanical parts. And they probably used probably just under 20 workers from Alabama and the Carolinas. And some woman who lived on the island also worked at the plant, but indoors, doing much less dangerous work than the workers outside did. When there was any trouble amongst the workers, a local policeman named Peter Hannaberry would simply escort the workers onto the ferry, either to South Fork or North Fork, and give them a one-way ticket and told not to come back. This camp was in operation for just about 7 years. It was ravaged by 2 back-to-back hurricanes and a pestilence, which ultimately led to its closing. In 1960, there were 2 recorded labor camps in Suffolk County, and sadly, there are no records there. And I'll point out that I mentioned earlier about the massive amount of documents I received from the Suffolk County Department of Health. Sadly, a lot of those records are from 1980 to present. By law, these agencies only have to keep these certain records by 7 years or so. And approximately 15 years ago, they moved from Riverhead to where they are now in Hauppauge, and a lot of the records were destroyed. So sadly, more information which could have been captured may just be lost forever. However, in the book, you'll notice an index which covers well over 100 camps that I was able to identify, if nothing else, at least by name, general street address, and hamlet they were in. Above all else, this book and this story is a human story. And the parties involved in it are, as I told you earlier, the migrant workers, the crew leaders who in essence contracted with the growers to basically rent the camp and recruit the workers and control every aspect of the workers' lives. The growers themselves simply outsourced all responsibility for the workers to the crew leaders. And as well, and the public, government, and Farm Bureau each have their own elements to play in this story. The best way to describe the economics of labor camps on Long Island was a cycle of perpetual debt. Housing, food, transportation, all costs, hidden or not, were usually paid by credit, were deducted from the weekly earnings of the workers. One woman complained in Riverhead in 1960 that that Social Security taxes were being taken out of her check, and she did not even have a Social Security card. It was that kind of example of the fraudulent activity that was going on at the hands of the crew leaders. Payday was always typically on Saturday nights. People have asked where the title Dust for Blood comes. One worker in a documentary explained that after working a week, all the workers would expect to receive a certain amount of wages, but it was always less because of these deductions. Hence, all the work for the amount of pay, he explained it as dust for blood. because many of these workers were recruited and enlisted, because many of them were prone to alcoholism, wine was often used to control the workforce. If workers were to complain or get bitter or angry about the situations, many crew leaders simply give them a bottle of wine and say, here, we'll talk about it tomorrow. And all that did was further the cycle of dependency. One of the large issues in this era was that there were no pay during work stoppages. So if a worker earned $1.35 per hour for an 8-hour day, that would have been $10.80 per hour. However, if a machine failed, or poor weather, but in this case, if a machine failed at a processing plant for 4 hours, the workers would have to remain on site and then would only work 4 hours out of 8. And this, in essence, cut their daily pay in half. And at the same time, they all incurred a daily debt of living at the camps. Workers who complained faced retaliation. In one case, or certain cases, the crew leaders, if they were vindictive, they would just simply say, well, they would not let them work for a few days. And again, while they stay back at the camp not earning an income, they continue to accrue the debt. In some cases, there was worse. There were beatings noted. In one case, a crew leader named Isaiah Moore at the Cutchong camp was irate at 4 migrant workers who complained they were feeling sick one day. It was a cold day. They were in the cabin, huddled for warmth. And the crew leader, in retaliation, cut the heating line to the cabin. The cabin stayed cold. Within 3 weeks, 3 of the 4 workers died from pneumonia because they were ill. It was that kind of retaliation and retaliatory tactics that many crew leaders engaged upon. Of course, theft, violence, manipulation, and exploitation were all too common. The crew leader's exploitation goes from start to finish, and it starts at the recruitment process. Again, they preyed upon vulnerable transients, adults and children. Many cases by false promises. In some cases, workers were taken by force, a term known as Shanghai. Workers, if they were outside of a bar or drunk or sleeping, they would simply be taken, put in a van or truck, and driven back to Long Island, and to wake up only to find out they're at a labor camp and have to work on farms. Carl Beeman was one such character and crew leader who drove a notorious red bus looking for these type of transients and people he can exploit. In 1968, a 15-year-old boy named Alfonso Mahone from Georgia was recruited by false promises in similar manner. He was brought up through Virginia, through New Jersey, and eventually worked at 2 labor camps in Bridgehampton, which is on the South Fork. He worked for approximately 2 weeks. He hurt his hand when he wanted to get some medical treatment. They denied him. When he complained, they evicted him from the camp. He made his way to Riverhead, approximately 25 miles away. Eventually, a volunteer group secured a ride home for him, and the Department of Labor was able to recoup the monies that were owed to him. And as tragic as that story sounds, that's actually a success story. Many workers don't have the opportunity to get back home, certainly as easily as that, or to recoup the money that was owed to them or denied. In essence, the crew leaders exerted full control over the lives of all the workers. Andrew Anderson was one example. The Cutchong labor camp. He was from Arkansas. He would contract with the farmers in Long Island, and knowing the places to search for workers, he went to them and explained that at the time, minimum wage in Arkansas was $1 an hour. It was $1.35 on Long Island. He would simply say, "Come on up. I'll give you a place to stay, a great restaurant to eat. You'll make more money. Everything will be great." The minute those workers stepped on that bus, they were indebted to Anderson for $15 each way to and from Long Island. $30 debt at this era is a massive amount of debt just to start. And when they got to the camp, they were met with the terrible conditions seen at the Cutchong labor camp. The Dixie Bell and restaurant I told you was owned by Anderson, so he got paid when the workers had to pay for their food and meals and all the other charges. Some other notable, but there were rare accounts of justice. James Brown, a crew leader in Mattituck, was charged with stealing $400 in wages from a group of workers and for running a camp without a license. James Colville in Riverhead was charged with beating his workers with the hammer and his fists. Ernest Mitchell was charged, also in Riverhead, was charged with beating a female workers, theft, and also tax evasion. He was a notorious and ruthless crew leader, a large man. He definitely imposing figure, and he did not hesitate to exert his will on the workers. The book delves into the psychological effects of these workers at the camps. Again, they were racked with boredom, and the camps were always located nearest town centers and isolated. There was little recreation, almost always never had telephones. Because they were seen as outsiders, there was little desire for the public to help. And many of them who did come single without a family had little family support to rely upon. This over time, weighs on a person, and it certainly did. No privacy, it led to, they were prone to theft, bullying, violence, harassment, and sexual abuse. Newsday reporter Les Payne spent a week undercover at a labor camp in Riverhead, and he explained, that expose, a 5-part series was quite riveting. He explained in many things, including the alcohol abuse at the camps. He explained that wine was the lifeblood of the migrant worker. People underestimate the dangers inherent with farm work, both then and now. Nationally at the time, it was the low life expectancy and high infant mortality rate. It was always dangerous and hard work. I mentioned stoop labor. The workers are out in the elements, always facing weather-related maladies and hazardous travel getting to and from the camps. Pesticide-related illnesses, the symptoms were there because Long Island never qualified for a federal or state survey. There weren't large enough farms. There never was any real testing done on that, but certainly the symptoms were there to conclude that pesticide poisoning was quite prevalent among the workers. This is an era many times before the banning of DDT and other dangerous poisons. So these workers were certainly suffering from that, as well as infectious diseases like tuberculosis and sexually transmitted diseases. And in many cases, because there was little access to adequate health care, it led to sad and unnecessary suffering and death. In 1956, a man named Arthur Drew Mattituck was found dead alongside of the road, suffering from pneumonia. In 1965, Willie Jeff Lawrence, also in Mattituck, he died from a fractured skull after being attacked by 1 week earlier by an intruder who broke into his cabin. So for a week, he had a concussion, didn't know, and he died a week later. In 1969, a man named James Biddle in Riverhead was found dead of a liver condition a day after he went to the hospital. He was not admitted. He was given aspirin, sent home, and that evening, or not home, he was sent to the camp. And that evening at the camp, he died. Turned out he had a grave liver condition. And in 1971, Pedro Fuentes, also in Riverhead, he was a known epileptic. He had a seizure out in the woods between camps, and his frozen body was found behind a tree in the woods, walking from one camp to the next. These are some examples of deaths that occurred where adequate health care or access to adequate health care could have prevented them, and sadly that did not happen. The book also discusses the many travel dangers, both on a national level, but certainly on a local level. The workers who get on board and take the risk of going to thousands of miles from Florida and southern states all the way up to New York and further. The job is always inherently dangerous. You're working on equipment. There were many injuries, including loss of limbs, toes, feet, fingers. The bending and crawling, very taxing on the body. By 1970, the accident rate for farm workers was 3 times higher than any other industry. And by 1980, it was deemed more dangerous than mining, which is quite alarming. And prior to 1965 in New York, farm workers had no access to workers' compensation. So if they were injured on the job, to get some money for that, they would have to sue in court, which without any help or representation would almost never happen. Here you see, I mentioned earlier about the travel dangers. This photo was taken from 1920 in New Jersey. You see how the railing is quite low and the people are crammed on. If this truck were to turn at a certain speed, many of these workers could easily topple over. And in many cases that did happen, both local and national. And of course, when you cram people in dangerous slum-like conditions and exploit them physically and economically, crime and violence are natural results. Arthur Bryant, in 1969, a local advocate for migrant workers in Reverend, stated, "Camp life is lawless. Rusty guns and shiny knives appear frequently. People seldom patrol, and a number of camps do not even have telephones so that a man may call the cops if he feels that he is being bullied. Criminal activity was widespread. There was theft, beatings, stabbings, gun violence, sexual abuse, and not only within the camps, but also around the camps and throughout the surrounding communities." One notable incident in 1955, a worker at a camp in Cutchong, stabbed another worker to death. He fled to the nearby woods. Police caught up with him. He admitted to the crime, spent time in jail, eventually came out, and that man became known as the blues artist known as Son House. Quite an alarming turnaround for him. All of this activity had dramatic effects on the county economy, the community, and first responders. I had the occasion to interview and speak with former Riverhead police chief. He explained to me back then, of course, there were no telephones, there were call boxes, and if you couldn't find one, you had 2 options: either talk your way out of trouble or fight your way out of trouble, which is quite an alarming statement from the police chief of Riverhead at the time. Riverhead, being what it is, it's the largest eastern municipal city located on Long Island. It's by standards compared to New York and large cities, of course, it's small, but for that far east, it is the largest area, and that attracted naturally many workers settled in the area. In 1960, 60% of the labor camps and 70% of the total workforce of migrant workers were located in Riverhead and Southold. So naturally, many of them did settle. Also, at the time, the demise of the Long Island duck industry was winding down, largely for environmental needs. And one large duck farm owner, Hollis Warner, he converted his duck farm properties that he used to raise ducks and into a rentable space, and he rented them to migrant workers who settled in the area, which will have, as you'll soon see, calamitous effects. And also, Riverhead at the time had no housing code, so anyone could really put up any structure, call it a home, and it would be legal. And this, this gave rise to the poverty-stricken areas known as the bottoms, and all of these conditions led to crime, suffering, and death, and again, a high impact on the county economy and first responders. And just by way of numbers regarding settlement, in 1960, 1,000 migrant workers settled in Riverhead, and just 10 years later, that number went up to 1,600. Not a large geographical area, but a large number of workers settling in the area, and these conditions certainly allowed for that. Here you see an abandoned shack in Riverhead in one of the areas that was previously known as the Bottoms. Here was a photo taken of a duck farm in 1920. This was called the Duck Brooder Building, B-R-O-O-D-E-R. This is where the hatchlings, and here you see inside, where the duck hatchlings were kept. And you can see the natural partitions, and Hollis Warner, who had properties like this on his property, on his farm, would partition these off, put up walls, and rent them all as livable space to migrant workers. No running water, no heat, terribly foul odor, insect insect problems and rodent problems always abound, and it's just really terrible living conditions for many workers, really in the middle of nowhere on his sprawling 500-acre farm. And again, there was no housing code to restrict this. Sadly, and I'll read a quote from Ruth Shire, a reporter from the Suffolk County News in 1956. When you crowd people in unsuitable quarters with inadequate facilities, tragedy is bound to strike, and it did. Even the most hostile communities can no longer feel complacent when they contemplate the charred bodies of children who have been trapped in dwellings away from good water pressure. There were many deaths, largely from negligence, poverty, misfortune. Again, the camps are always dangerous, and operators cut corners. Workers, due to poverty, took their own chances, sneaking in kerosene heaters and stoves. Misfortune was always abound. In 1950, a family of 4 was living in a chicken coop in Bridgehampton, and that is not a typo. You heard me correctly. They were living in a chicken coop in Bridgehampton. Well, the parents were out one day and they had 2 babies that were left behind in the coop. A fire broke out. The babies perished. From that formed the Bridgehampton Child Care Center, which still exists today, does great work for the community. The community felt a dire need to protect children. In January of 1959, in Riverhead alone, in 11 days, there were 8 deaths. I think of Port Dilcia Trent, a 22-year-old mother with 3 young children, all under the age of 3, the youngest an infant. It was a cold day. They're living in a rundown shack in Riverhead. She went to light a large kerosene heater to get heat for the family. When she lit the match fell onto the rug. The rug was already saturated with kerosene and started to go up in flames. In desperation, she rolled up the carpet to bring it to another room. She accidentally knocked over the kerosene heater. The 80-pound kerosene heater of a young woman. She tried to pick it up. She got kerosene all over her clothing, and within seconds, she too went up in flames. She ran out in agony to douse the flames by rolling around in the mud. Within seconds, the place went up. The 3 children perished, and she had 80% burns on 80% of her body, and she died 1 week later. Then in 1961, I mentioned the 4 bodies, the 4 men who died at the Cutchong labor camp, which was started because they couldn't afford the 75-cent cost of meals, so they snuck in the kerosene stove. In 1968, there was a fire at Jacob's labor camp with three people, including a woman named Myrtle Lee Grant, who also perished. Miss Grant was a mute. She could not, and also an epileptic, and she was unable to speak or scream, and she died silently and sadly. In 1982, a man named Spanish McGee of Riverhead was also in the migrant stream. He left and he looked for work. He was homeless. He was known throughout the community as Spanish McGee. He walked through town with a long black overcoat and 2 mutts, 2 dogs who were his only companions. His body was found in 1982 outside of a homeless shack, a rundown shack that he was living in. Now, these are the sad, terrible endings for many in the migrant stream that were part of this history. The book does delve into some outspoken critics who I've called better angels. These people face scorn and ridicule and even death threats for their effort. Reverend Arthur Bryant from Greenport spent better part of a decade lobbying hard and advocating for migrant workers. He testified before Congress in 1969. He appeared in TV and radio shows, and for all his efforts, he too faced death threats. Mary Chase Stone, a woman from New England area, she came from a life of luxury, gave that all up to resettle in Riverhead, and dedicated a life to fight for the migrant workers. She formed a nonprofit volunteer group called Long Island Volunteers. They were the first group to secure federal funding for a migrant labor program. Also, the VISTA, the Volunteers in Service of America, was a federal program where interns would join and stay at the camps and learn ways to improve upon the camps or offer solutions and try to help out. There were local groups as well. Health department inspectors, they were always understaffed and overworked. When they go out and they would issue fines and imprisonment, and they too faced threats and violence for their efforts. And really the farmers and growers and camp operators always relied upon the no trespassing laws, which was strictly enforced, and it denied access to labor camps. And those who did try to enter the camps to report on them, it often led to violent encounters. One notable reporter, Carl Grossman, was filming with a local assemblyman, and one of the trustees actually took a piece of wood and hit Carl over the head and cut him open badly. There were reports of farmers pulling out shotguns and threatening people, get off the land. And this was all occurred on Long Island, as well as many other camps throughout the country as well. Eventually, by 1971, there was a federal case where Judge Fox in Michigan ruled that these workers, just because they're part of the labor camp, do not give up their bundle of rights. And the case ruled that nonprofit groups like reporters, social justice groups, and labor unions do and can have access to these farms to report and study upon the conditions at the camps. Now, I wish I could tell you that there was some mass humanitarian push like you've seen in Long Island and in California in the 1970s, that there were public rallies, but there were not. This era really came from the shifting in farming ideologies. The increased usage of machinery led to the less necessary use of manpower, and then less labor camps. Also at the time, there was a heavy and sharp decrease in potato production. In 1954, there were 45,000 acres of potatoes planted. By 1997, there were less than 6,000 acres, a dramatic drop over time. There was also a sharp increase in land values. Anyone who's familiar with the area, the affordability is very limited. It's a very wealthy and affluent, still is a very wealthy and affluent areas in Suffolk County. And many farmers, with that in mind, just simply cashed out. They already had a tough life, difficult market, environmental issues, and they realized that that was the time to cash out. And by 1971, 1/3 of the county's 68,000 farms were owned by prospectors. And then shortly thereafter, those prospectors sold the land to the modern day vineyard owners. I had the good fortune to speak with the first vineyard owner on Long Island, Louisa Hargrave, and she explained that she purchased her land in Cutchong from a prospector who purchased his land off a potato farmer. So it just kind of came around full circle. As far as historical legacy, I always leave that to the reader to decide. In my opinion, it certainly is a shameful legacy with enough blame to go around. The crew leaders, of course, were the most villainous. The growers as well had blame, where they outsourced all responsibility, knowing full well what was going on in all of these camps, yet turning their back and just simply using them as a pool of labor for their needs. The public as well, there was a lot of indifference and willful ignorance to the conditions. I've given many talks now, and many of them just never aware of these camps, and many of them lived lifelong Long Islanders. And the government was largely ineffective. They never really had to act. Their constituents were the powerful agricultural industry, and they never really had the ability or political will to make change. And in closing, I would just say that this is a sad example where industry was valued far higher and far greater than human life, which is an all too sad trend that still goes on today. Again, the book is Long Island Migrant Labor Camps, Dust for Blood. It was released on March 22nd. It's available through History Press as well as Amazon. And I encourage you to get it. I'm proud of the efforts. It was a first-time book capturing such a sobering and lengthy history for so many years. So with that, I'll share it back, and if there are any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
Oh, Mark, thank you so much. That was very, very informative and enlightening. It sheds lights on tragic events in American history that have been forgotten or overlooked. So, for that, I thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask the audience if they have any questions. Use the reactions button to show a raised hand, and we'll go from there. Patricia, yes. How are you, Patricia?
Hi, Dino. It's good to see you. And
Same here.
I read the book. I want to thank you, Mr. Torres. It was extraordinary. I've been sitting with it, and it was heartbreaking. It was such an important, in-depth research project for you. And I read, hoping that Alfonso got back to his mom, and was so happy that that was a positive, good story. My question is those films that tried to bring it forward. One I think was in 1963, maybe one was in 1960. Is there a way to view those now? Are they easily accessible?
Yes, well, Harvest of Shame, the 1960 is simple, just your YouTube. It'll if you put in Harvest of Shame, if you're looking for a closer link, Edward R. Murrow, the renowned journalist from CBS, that's a fascinating take, but that was on a national scale. That covered from Florida all the way up through all the camps, and it is referenced, the 2 camps referenced on that film of Long Island. But again, it's a kind of a fast-moving, wider group. The 1968 What Harvest for the Reaper is a bit more challenging to find. But if you really kind of, eventually I was able to locate it. I almost had to go to Georgia, one of the few schools that had it at the time. But eventually I found it online. And I believe it's cited in the book. You'll be able to find the link. And that is very rare, very well produced. And also I'll point out that was shown before Congress in 1969 with Arthur Bryant and others to show the conditions at the camps. Very powerful production.
Well, you are certainly one of the better angels. I feel very strongly about that, and I'm just thankful that you're with us today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I certainly channeled inspiration from those who tried so hard at the time. And being a man of labor, spending my life representing, fighting for working conditions. I've never had the occasion to represent farm workers, but I certainly see them as brothers and sisters in labor, and will do all I can, pro bono or otherwise, to help them going forward.
Thank you, Patricia. Anybody else? All right. I have a few questions, Mark. Actually, one is actually an add-on to what you were just discussing. In your career as a lawyer representing labor, have you seen in more contemporary times any interesting parallels or unfortunate parallels between what you describe in the book and what you've described in this presentation and what you've had to deal with as a lawyer?
Thankfully, no. I think that over time, many things changed. And that goes to state laws. I know recently New York passed a new state law that allows farm workers to join unions to fight for conditions, although that's being challenged, but nothing of this magnitude. The fact that it went on, but that's, I say that cautiously. I'm happy to say I haven't seen it personally, but that doesn't mean in some respects that it goes on in different forms. I do know now that farm workers still struggle. COVID's decimating them. There's still lack of federal labor law protections. The new administration is proposing, and hopefully they'll pass something to offer relief. I've been contacting the Farm Worker Justice on a national level to find out more, and a local level, the Eastern Farm Worker Association, and they tell me conditions on the ground are different, but certainly the levels of discrimination and some aspects of treatment are still poor.
Was this a seasonal kind of approach, or was the contract that they brought them here, was this something lengthy, or was it in a seasonal kind of context?
Well, typically the potato seasons would run from August to November, but Long Island was so crop abundant that it generally ran, I would say, 9 months out of the year. running through December and January. And then that you also factor in many of the migrants who stayed in the area and settled in Riverhead. And it's important to point out when we say contracts, the contracts were between the crew leader and the growers. And I say that distinction because there were some Puerto Rican workers, and I mentioned this in the book, and it's important to point out, that came under a working contract. In many ways, they were like represented by a labor union. They had guaranteed work hours, pay for when work was down. But that was by far in the minority, maybe a couple of hundred workers at most, because clearly that wasn't cost efficient for the growers who realized we can get it cheaper without these contracts. So the contracts between the crew leaders, and it was annual. So the same crew leaders would generally come back year after year. If they didn't already remain on Long Island for most of the time anyway, they were known well enough that they continuously contracted with the growers. And they would contact each other and say, all right, let's set it up again for next year. And it would continue on that for many years.
Oh.
I have a question.
Yes.
Sure. So what would make a migrant worker want to come back in light of how deplorable the conditions were is my first one. And it sounds like what you described is primarily people of color and primarily Black who were the migrant workers. And I wonder if their race and obviously their socioeconomic status had anything to do with, the lack of public support for addressing some of these issues.
Sure, thank you. And that is a question I grappled with as I was reading, researching, and writing this story. Why come back? They knew full well what awaited them, but it's also an indication of how bad it must have been from where they came. The South was plagued with poverty, limited opportunities, and it also led to the possibilities of something like Riverhead, right? If you can resettle in an area close enough to the camps and the farms, that maybe you can make it work and maybe get out of the migrant stream altogether. And that's part of why Riverhead was such an alluring thing. The book centrally focuses on the conditions of Long Island, but of course, it's known. And some of my research and just from historical elements, that the areas they came from were at least economically worse. And that really is a sad plight. I think of Alfonso Mahone, the 15-year-old boy. The crew leader pulled up by the house. There were a bunch of boys playing around, and a woman gets out of a car following the bus, and she says, "Hey, you guys are doing nothing. There's not much opportunity. Why don't you come to Long Island?" And Mahone's mother actually said, "Okay." She approved them going. So that really gave an indication of how, the limited possibilities from those locations, and that led to somewhere where the allure of more money and a lot of work and a lot of crops on Long Island was perhaps for many of them too great to ignore. As far as the race and status, yes, many of the workers eventually were Black farm workers from the South. Although I think typically this really would be a class system story where the farmers and growers and crew leaders would have been welcomed anyone from wherever they came, as long as they were willing to do the work and face those conditions. Many of these crew leaders did come from those same areas, so they had that little insight that they thought they can use to their ruthless exploitation, which is what they did. I was asked, and of course, elements of race were involved. I think of in 1966 at the Hollis-Warner Duck Farm, which at the time had 500 or so people living in squalid conditions. There was a race drive. There was a voting drive to help people sign up to vote, to make changes when they can. And of course, that led to vitriol. I know that was led by the Congress on Racial Equality. Lincoln Lynch was a prominent and vocal supporter of that. And in the book, on the back cover, he's actually getting arrested. You see him being arrested for protesting these conditions. So certainly, race, status, class, were all in the mix. And I think because the crew leaders had that inside knowledge of where they can go and who they can recruit on a continuous basis, that eventually led to the many of the workers coming back pretty much with intimate knowledge of the crew leaders in the system.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I can say that I'm really been promoting this book, and the more I discuss it and share it, it's more than a book. It's history. It's history that was suppressed. It's history that was lost. And it's a great honor for me to have captured it and written it and shared it. And really primarily for these settings. These are one of the settings I cherish the most, to share it in academic circles, to teach others, to promote further learnings and research. Because if we forget our history, then we're lost as a society. So it was important to have gone on that. And just recently, the book was featured in the New York Post article, Newsday as well. So we'll soon be covering it. And I reached out by Metro Focus on PBS, who also wants an interview. And I'm more than happy to share this with ever and whomever would like to hear it. So it's certainly an important mission.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. I have one last question before the hour is up. How knowledgeable, because I know you mentioned that the camps were a distance away from like the more populated areas. How knowledgeable was the local community of the goings on in these camps?
Well, knowledgeable enough that many of them would say, oh, Saturday nights rolling around is more trouble. There was clearly a lot of ostracization going on. People buried their heads, ignored it, looked away. And in some respects, it was easy to do because the camps were located in areas that were, not in the heart of town. Now, it could be 3 miles away. It could be in Riverhead, close, relatively close, but people just had a way of kind of turning their back and ignoring it.
Mhm.
But to be fair, of course, some people just genuinely did not know. And that was because of the secretive and enforced nature of keeping outsiders out. Although I do credit tremendously the reporters on the scene, and the level 300 newspaper articles I was able to report, but a lot of it did fall on deaf ears. And remember one last thing, this was part of a massive agricultural industry for an area that was incredibly affluent with a high output. So that was certainly going to trump any other type of and suppress any type of negative things going on at the camp.
Right. Yeah. From your research and your understanding of Long Island, how informed are the people in Long Island today about this part of the island's history?
Well, I think these events are informing them, and I think that was part of the purpose. I could say this: there was a level of suppression. I know in Suffolk County, in some of these towns, they could tell you where the first settlers landed, where the first oak tree was planted. They have records dating way back, but you will not find records on slavery, and there was slavery on Long Island. You will not find records, public records, certainly enough without digging, like I did, on this issue as well as an indentured servitude. So a lot of it was purposely suppressed. There were many eager for me to tell and kind of rooting from the sidelines, and perhaps they had political constraints or maybe even their own jobs on the line if they had written about it in a public way. So it's certainly a shameful history that many kind of went to great lengths to keep it quiet.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
And I was blessed to be able to not feel those constraints, but at the same time, use that as my inspiration to tell the story.
Right. Yeah. Well, we all thank you for bringing this to light. And, hopefully this opens up others to pursue this kind of research and bring to the surface other, tragic moments in American history, especially, so recent in our time. You wouldn't really expect this to span into, 30, 40 years ago, or 50 years ago. So I think that, the fact that you're bringing this to light, I hope inspires others to continue this research and, bring other, tragic and sad moments in our local and regional history to light. So, for that, I thank you. And I do thank you for everything. I just do want to stress a couple of things to everybody that, Mark, you've also written some crime novels. Am I right? Some fictional crime novels,
Yes.
A Stirring in the North Fork and Adeline. Adeline?
Yes.
Okay. And do you want to just briefly
Well, and people have asked, because both of those are fictional crime novels, but they have elements of history and teachable moments. And I realize that that's what I long for. In fact, my first book, Stirring in the North Fork, which occurred out in Cutchong, and I did include the Cutchong labor camp into that story. That's where I first learned of the camp. And I said, I'm going to come back to the story because it really seems like important history, and I'm glad I did. In Adeline, I covered, in fact, it does cover in Rockland County. I covered the mental health treatment in New York State And I used a fictional mental health facility in a fictional town in Rockland County, but it was modeled after the notorious mental hospitals throughout the state. And for much of the 20th century, the treatment and the sudden change, the dramatic change there, including with the advent of Thorazine and certain medicines, that those camps, those hospitals were no longer needed. And many of them were simply just, the patients were simply dropped off at Times Square, simply dumped off by bus. And that, you notice immediately a sharp rise in the prison population. So it was a kind of a teachable moment there in that book as well. And this, of course, my first foray into nonfiction historical, I realized that that's where I wanted to be. I wanted to find something so genuine and true and share it. And in this case, I was, from a historical perspective, fortunate to find something that was never written about, to share it. But at the same time, because it was never written about, I knew I had that obligation to get it right and to put it out. And I'm glad I've done both.
And for that, we're very thankful, and we're very thankful to have had you here today. Thank you
very much.
Thank
Have
you.
a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. My first reaction is just wow. This was a fantastic presentation about a sad time in our history, but I found it to be eye-opening and definitely want to know more. So again, I echo Dino's remarks of thanks for joining us today. I also want to extend big thanks to, of course, Dino for facilitating today's discussion, to Bill Hofield, one of our adjuncts who brought the book and Mark to our attention, so I appreciate him doing so, to the School of Education and Social Science and the School of Arts and Humanities for co-sponsoring today's discussion with my office, to Unity and Community for including our event in this week of activities. Of course, I thank each of you for attending and joining us today for this important discussion. And as always, I can't make these take place or happen without the very capable assistance of strategic marketing. So before we wrap up and leave for today, I want to mention that we have another program coming up tomorrow, What's Next After the 2020 Election. It will take place, as indicated on the screen, tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Pre-registration is required, so please go ahead and do that. But it promises to be another thoughtful discussion with, this time, faculty members from Rockland Community College. So again, thank you for joining us. Have a great day.